There's a specific mental shift some people eventually make, one so complete that it changes everything about how a narcissist experiences their continued existence in your world. It's not about pretending someone has died in any literal sense. It's about something psychologically similar, complete removal from your ongoing reality, the same way you don't check on, wonder about, or organize any part of your day around someone who's genuinely permanently gone. Today, we're going to trace exactly what this specific mental posture actually involves, why it produces such a devastating effect, and how it differs from every other form of distance we've examined throughout this entire series. Let's start with understanding what makes this posture distinct from ordinary no contact, ordinary detachment, or ordinary indifference, because the difference matters enormously for understanding why it produces such a specific severe effect. The distinction, ordinary distance, still holds space for eventual possibility. This posture holds none at all. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine detachment, the release of hope, the calm indifference that offers nothing for narcissistic tactics to work with. Even genuine detachment, as we've examined it extensively, often retains some small, theoretical space for possibility, even if that possibility is never actively pursued or hoped for. This specific posture removes even that theoretical space entirely. It's the difference between, "I've released my need for this to change, but I suppose it theoretically could," and "this simply isn't part of my reality anymore, in any sense at all, past, present, or future." Here's why this distinction matters so significantly for the effect it produces. Remember everything we've traced about how heavily narcissistic psychology depends on the fantasy of eventual return, the deferral mechanism that allows genuine loss to be postponed indefinitely as long as some theoretical possibility of reconciliation remains available. Ordinary detachment, however genuine and however complete, typically still leaves this theoretical possibility technically intact, even if neither person actively pursues it. This specific posture removes it entirely, which produces something considerably more severe than the crisis we've traced throughout previous conversations about ordinary sustained absence. Here's what this actually looks like in practice, worth understanding in concrete, specific terms. It means genuinely, completely removing any residual curiosity about his current life, his current relationships, his current apparent success or apparent struggle. It means responding to any information that happens to reach you about him with the same complete non-reaction you'd offer information about someone who no longer exists in any form relevant to your own life. It means his birthday, anniversaries connected to the relationship, moments that might otherwise trigger memory or reflection, simply passing without any internal acknowledgement at all. The same way you don't mark occasions connected to people who are genuinely, permanently absent from your ongoing existence. Here's why achieving this specific posture proves so much more difficult than ordinary detachment. And understanding this difficulty matters for calibrating realistic expectations about what it actually requires. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how gradually and how difficultly genuine detachment actually develops. This more complete posture requires considerably more than the internal work we've traced previously. It requires releasing not just hope for reconciliation, but the entire ongoing narrative structure most people maintain about people who remain, in some sense, still part of their story, even a distant or resolved part. Let's trace what actually happens once this specific posture genuinely develops, because the effect it produces differs meaningfully from everything we've examined throughout previous conversations about sustained absence and genuine detachment. Here's the first thing worth understanding. Connecting to everything we've traced extensively about narcissistic dependence on the fantasy of eventual return. Remember what we discussed about how this fantasy allows genuine loss to be deferred indefinitely, protecting his psychology from having to fully confront permanent absence as long as some theoretical possibility remains technically available. This specific posture, once it genuinely, completely develops on your side, removes something his psychology has almost no capacity to detect through ordinary means, but that it nonetheless registers at some level. The complete absence of any remaining narrative thread connecting your ongoing life back to him in any form. This absence is worth understanding as qualitatively different from silence, even sustained, complete silence. Silence, however genuine, still technically allows for the possibility that circumstances might eventually change, that the silence itself represents a choice that could theoretically be revisited. This more complete posture removes even the sense that a choice is being actively maintained, because active maintenance still requires some ongoing relationship to the question of whether to remain silent or not. What we're describing instead operates without any ongoing relationship to that question at all, the same way you don't actively choose, moment to moment, not to think about someone who genuinely no longer exists in your reality. Here's what makes this distinction produce such a severe effect, connecting to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about narcissists needing your attention more than your love. Remember everything we discussed about how his psychology depends on some form of continued relevance, even negative relevance, in order to maintain a sense of significance. Anger still confirms relevance. Even genuine calm indifference, as we've traced it throughout previous conversations, still technically confirms that you've formed some settled position regarding him, which represents its own form of ongoing relevance, however minimal. This more complete posture removes even this minimal relevance, offering something his psychology has genuinely no framework for detecting or processing at all: the complete absence of his existing as a category in your ongoing awareness whatsoever. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this specific posture, once genuinely achieved, tends to produce more severe effects than even the sustained, complete absence we traced extensively throughout our conversation about what happens when you stay gone. Remember what we discussed about predictive collapse, about the crisis of confidence that develops when his usual model for understanding relationships fails against sustained, genuine absence. This more complete posture intensifies that collapse considerably, because it removes not just his access to you, but his capacity to construct any narrative at all about what your continued silence might mean, what it might represent, what possibility it might theoretically still hold. There's simply nothing there for his psychology to construct meaning around, no ongoing relationship to your absence for him to interpret, analyze, or eventually hope to reverse. Here's what's worth understanding about how this specific posture connects to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine, complete healing, rather than existing as some separate, more extreme technique distinct from everything else this series has examined. This posture isn't actually a deliberate strategy you construct and maintain through ongoing effort. It represents instead the natural, eventual endpoint of genuine healing taken to its fullest, most complete conclusion. The same genuine detachment we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations, simply matured past the point where any residual narrative structure, any residual sense of ongoing relationship to the question of his presence or absence, remains active at all. This distinction matters enormously for understanding why attempting to perform this posture deliberately before genuine healing has actually reached this specific depth typically fails to produce its intended effect. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissists remaining remarkably skilled at detecting performance, at sensing the underlying orientation hiding beneath even sophisticated strategic calm. A performed version of this posture, one where you're actively working to convince yourself and perform for anyone watching that he no longer exists in your reality, while secretly still maintaining considerable internal narrative structure around his absence, doesn't actually produce the effect we've traced throughout today's conversation, because the underlying psychological reality remains fundamentally different from what genuine, complete absence of ongoing narrative structure actually requires. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it, rather than leaving this conversation as simply a description of an extreme psychological posture without addressing what genuinely matters most. Whether this specific state is actually something worth deliberately pursuing, and what its genuine achievement actually requires and costs. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. This specific posture, however powerful in its effect on narcissistic psychology, isn't necessarily something everyone needs to reach, and pursuing it as a goal in itself can actually work against the genuine healing this entire series has traced throughout dozens of previous conversations. Remember everything we've established about the difference between genuine detachment that develops naturally through completed grief and rebuilt self-trust versus forced psychological states pursued specifically to produce a desired effect in someone else. If you find yourself actively working to achieve complete absence of narrative structure specifically because you want to produce the devastating effect on him that we've traced throughout today's conversation, you've paradoxically kept yourself oriented around him in exactly the way this entire series has cautioned against, even while pursuing what sounds like the most extreme form of release available. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that offers a more honest and more sustainable way to think about this specific posture. Rather than treating it as a technique to actively pursue, understand it instead as accurate description of where genuine complete healing eventually naturally arrives, without requiring deliberate cultivation. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the specific markers of genuine progress, the shrinking gap between trigger and recovery, the question about whether you'd feel exactly as complete without ever receiving further information about him. This more complete posture represents simply the furthest point along that same continuum, reached naturally through sustained, genuine healing, rather than through deliberate, forced effort to arrive there faster than genuine internal work actually allows. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about what this specific state genuinely costs, worth naming honestly, rather than presenting it as pure, uncomplicated triumph. Complete absence of any ongoing narrative structure regarding someone who was once genuinely significant in your life represents, in some sense, a genuine kind of loss worth acknowledging directly. It means the relationship, whatever value it once held despite its ultimate harm, has been fully, completely released from your ongoing story, without even the residual narrative thread that ordinary detachment typically maintains. This isn't necessarily something to mourn, but it's worth understanding as genuinely significant rather than simply celebrating it as costless triumph over someone who caused you harm. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. The devastating effect this posture produces in him. However genuinely real and however thoroughly we've traced its mechanism throughout today's conversation, was never actually the reason this level of healing matters. Remember everything we've established about how your own peace was never meant to depend on tracking or confirming his internal experience. This applies exactly as much to this more extreme posture as it did to every other form of detachment we've examined throughout this entire series. The value of reaching this specific point isn't the devastation it produces in him. It's the genuine, complete freedom it represents for you. Freedom from any ongoing narrative structure, any residual internal relationship to a story that's fully, completely finished. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. If you find yourself, through genuine, sustained healing rather than forced effort, naturally arriving at this specific posture, complete absence of curiosity, complete absence of internal narrative structure, complete indifference that doesn't require active maintenance because there's genuinely nothing left requiring maintenance at all, Understand this as evidence of extraordinary, complete healing, not as a technique you successfully deployed against him. And if you haven't arrived there, if genuine, ordinary detachment remains your current, honest reality, understand that this represents genuine, sufficient healing in its own right, not a lesser or incomplete version of something you should be actively working to surpass. This specific posture, whatever devastating effect it happens to produce, was never actually the goal this entire series has been building toward. The goal, throughout every single conversation we've traced across this entire series, was always simply this: your own genuine peace, your own genuine wholeness, your own genuine life, built entirely on your own terms, regardless of what stage of detachment that peace happens to require, and regardless of whether that peace ever produces any specific, confirmable effect on someone whose story no longer requires your continued attention in order to have already genuinely, completely ended. Requires your continued attention in order to have already genuinely, completely ended. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses a specific question worth examining honestly. Is there a meaningful difference between someone who arrives at this posture through genuine, complete healing and someone who arrives at something that looks identical from the outside, but that actually developed through a different, less healthy mechanism? Genuine emotional numbing, dissociation, or a broader pattern of disconnecting from feeling as a general coping strategy rather than something specific to this particular relationship. This distinction matters enormously because the two can appear nearly indistinguishable from the outside while representing genuinely different internal realities worth understanding clearly. Here's the practical way to check which one actually describes your own experience. Genuine, healthy arrival at this posture, developed through the sustained work this entire series has traced across dozens of conversations, typically coexists with genuine, full emotional capacity in every other area of your life. You can still feel deeply moved by a film, still experience genuine joy at a friend's good news, still cry at something genuinely sad, still feel the full range of human emotion in every other context, while this specific posture applies narrowly and specifically to him and only him. If instead you notice a broader pattern, difficulty feeling much of anything across many areas of your life, a general emotional flatness that extends well beyond this specific relationship, a sense that you've disconnected from feeling in general rather than achieving specific, complete peace regarding one particular person. This suggests something different from healthy healing, something that deserves genuine attention, likely with professional support, rather than being mistaken for the specific, targeted posture we've traced throughout today's conversation. This distinction matters because pursuing what looks like this posture through general emotional numbing rather than genuine, specific healing doesn't actually produce the freedom this entire series has traced throughout so many previous conversations. It produces something considerably less valuable, a narrower, more constrained emotional life overall, purchased at a cost that extends well beyond simply releasing one specific person from your ongoing narrative. Genuine healing, by contrast, actually tends to expand your emotional capacity generally, precisely because the energy previously consumed by hypervigilant monitoring and unresolved grief regarding this specific relationship becomes available for richer, fuller engagement with everything else in your life, rather than producing a general contraction of feeling across every domain. Here's something worth understanding about how to actually verify this distinction in your own experience. Since intellectual understanding of the difference doesn't automatically tell you which category genuinely applies to you, notice, over the coming weeks, whether your capacity for joy, for grief about other things, for genuine connection with people currently in your life feels expansive and full, or whether it feels similarly muted and distant to whatever you're experiencing regarding him specifically. If your emotional life feels rich and full everywhere except in relation to him, this suggests genuine, healthy, specific healing exactly as this entire series has traced. If it feels similarly flat and distant across the board, this deserves honest attention as something separate from and potentially more concerning than the specific healing process we've examined throughout today's conversation. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, one that addresses something important about how this specific posture, even when genuinely, healthily achieved, relates to future relationships and future connections you might build. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the risk of over-applying frameworks developed for genuinely narcissistic relationships in ways that damage healthy connection instead. This complete, specific posture, genuine absence of narrative structure regarding him, was never meant to become your default relational stance applied broadly to everyone in your life, present or future. It represents something specific and narrow, developed in response to genuine, sustained harm from a specific person whose pattern warranted exactly this level of complete release. If you notice yourself beginning to apply this same complete absence of narrative structure, this same refusal to hold any ongoing space for someone's presence in your life, toward new people who haven't actually demonstrated the pattern that made this specific response appropriate with him, this deserves careful, honest examination. Genuine healing produces discernment, not blanket, indiscriminate application of the most extreme protective response available to every subsequent relationship, regardless of whether that response is genuinely warranted. The capacity to reach this specific posture with him doesn't mean it should become your standard operating mode with everyone, and confusing the two risks costing you exactly the genuine rich connection this entire series has consistently emphasized as the actual goal underlying all the protective work we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations. This is ultimately the balanced understanding worth carrying forward from everything we've examined today. Complete, genuine absence of any ongoing narrative structure regarding someone who caused you genuine, sustained harm represents extraordinary, hard-won healing, worth honoring fully when it genuinely, naturally develops. But it remains specific to exactly the circumstances that warranted it, never meant to generalize into permanent guardedness against genuine connection with people who've done nothing to warrant this same complete release. You've learned something extraordinary about your own capacity for complete freedom from someone who genuinely deserved exactly this response. That learning protects you specifically and precisely, without requiring you to close yourself off from the very connection and the very depth of feeling that made you an empath.